Did you know one American headquarters moved an entire war under fire on Christmas Eve? At high noon on the 24th of December 1941, sirens screamed and Manila's port exploded. Yet General Douglas MacArthur kept working at his desk. The Jap planes are 90 seconds away. I will be there in plenty of time, he told Lieutenant Cole. David L. Hardy, who hustled the United States Army forces in the Far East Staff into a stone shelter, and then onto the inter-island ship Don Esteban for a night run to Corregidor's Malinta Tunnel. The sky glowed orange. Sternberg General Hospital burned. The whole thing looked like a billion-dollar Christmas tree. Hardy wrote beauty and horror in the same breath. The Don Esteban cast off at 7:30 p.m. By midnight, the entire headquarters was underground, out of sight before daylight could give them away. Hardy was a newly minted lieutenant colonel, assigned to the makeshift Provisional Air Corps Regiment, a unit of grounded airmen turned infantry. He had watched the Far East Air Force burn on the ground at Clark Field. Now, he watched a city burn and an army bend without breaking. The staff work calls, manifests, transport control looked boring, but it saved lives and kept the campaign coherent. Even in chaos, Americans hit their marks. You could set your watch by their appearance, Hardy said of the raiders. Americans answered with their own clockwork. The Japanese had air superiority and momentum. What they did not have was a system that could absorb shock and keep moving. The evacuation under fire proved American strengths that would scale across the Pacific. Logistics, trust up and down the chain, and leaders who stayed cool when seconds mattered. MacArthur stepped into the shelter only when the first bombs were already falling. Then he reappeared to supervise a pierside loading sequence that finished before dusk. The Don Esteban pushed off at 7:30 p.m., reached Corregidor near midnight, and the convoy melted into the tunnel before sunrise. Here is the American twist. This was not just survival. It was cadence. The move on December 24 kept the headquarters intact for the months of siege that followed and set a tone. Calm work, under fire, for the sake of everybody else. The last image is seared into Hardy's memory. Sternberg General Hospital ablaze, Manila Bay lit orange. The tunnel ahead, black and safe. From that tunnel, America would fight back, step by step, until the gates of the prisons opened. That night became a blueprint. Stay steady, move fast, save the mission, and bring your people home. Did you know a regiment of pilots and crewmen fought as foot soldiers for 73 straight days? Hardy called them the Battling Bastards of Bataan, a Provisional Air Corps regiment that dug foxholes and fired M1 Garans like veteran infantry, while quinine ran short and malaria crept through the lines. Promised relief never came. On the 9th of April 1942, Bataan surrendered, the largest surrender in American history. The numbers hurt like shrapnel. About 78,100 prisoners, including 11,796 Americans, went into captivity on Bataan. 25,580 Americans were captured across the Philippines by mid-1942, and 10,650, 42%, died in captivity. Hardy was taken the next day and began 34 months as a prisoner. The road to the prison camps began with the Bataan Death March. It killed 650 Americans and about 10,000 Filipinos before the cages even closed. Those who staggered into Camp O'Donnell and Cabanatuan met a deadlier trio disease, malnutrition, and beatings that claimed roughly 4,100 American lives by the end of 1942. Thousands more would later die at sea when unmarked Japanese transports, the hellships, were sunk in the fog of a global war. The facts are not rumor, they are the plain record of men who counted their dead and wrote the names. What kept men moving was a code. Hardy's own letter to his wife. "Don't worry about me. Be of good cheer, strong and courageous," reads like a field order to himself and to those around him. The enemy held the ground. Americans held a standard. When bullets and food ran out, that standard did not. It carried from trail to camp, and finally, years later, to the day the gates opened. That is why a starving line of Americans could still look like a unit and not a mob. Hardee's Provisional Air Corps Regiment, built from grounded Far East Air Force mechanics, armourers and pilots, held a line with scavenged trucks and borrowed guns, laying wire, registering mortars, and logging each clip of ammunition, while President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to Australia and the men on Bataan fought on. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and sick, but they kept order. In war, order is life. In America's hands, order becomes power. Did you know a single paragraph of international law could not shield Americans from a policy that treated surrender as shame? In January 1942, Tokyo announced it would observe the 1929 Geneva Convention with necessary modifications, meaning only when it did not conflict with Japanese policies and regulations. That change in words matched a change in doctrine. Revisions to the Japanese Field Service Code recast capture as disgrace and hardened everyday abuse. Now, a question. How do you break a modern army without meeting it head-on? You strip its supplies, beat it on the road, and herd the survivors into camps that cannot feed them. The Death March killed 650 Americans and about 10,000 Filipinos. O'Donnell and Cabanatuan killed roughly 4,000, 100 more Americans by the end of 1942. Then came the sea. Thousands died aboard unmarked hellships when submarines torpedoed convoys that hid POWs among troops and cargo. Every number sits in the record. Every number has a name. Captain George A. Mudzi of Temple University, an educator turned officer who helped turn eyewitness statements into citations, died aboard Oryoku Maru on the 15th of December 1944 after a U.S. attack on the unmarked transport. Chick Fowler, 71st Field Artillery, PA, survived blindness and wounds and here is Hardee again, writing to his wife. Don't worry about me, be of good cheer, strong and courageous. The enemy's shock came later, when notebooks and deposition lists emerged. Prisoners had recorded deaths by day and by name. Editors matched those notes to tribunal testimony after the war and built a ledger the world could read. The legal promise, broken in 1942, returned as a court record in 1946. The bridge to liberation was not just armoured brigades and air support, it was memory turned into justice, and it made the coming American push more than a rescue. The smell in those first camps was carbolic and decay. Rice looked like sweepings. When someone fell, the line closed and kept moving. Yet even there, Americans taught classes, fixed pumps, and kept rosters because order saves lives. Ask again. How do you break a modern army? You don't, if its people believe tomorrow will count and someone will bring them home. The ledger kept faith with the living and the dead, and it warned the enemy that the day of reckoning was already on the calendar. Did you know the gates of Old Bilibid prison opened in a rush of boots, bandages and relief on the 4th of February 1945? Elements of the 148th Infantry Regiment, 37th Division, cut into Manila and found hundreds of Allied service members and civilians who had been held for years. Many guards had fled the day before. Major Orville C. Went of Ohio addressed the freed men with the steady tone of a battalion executive officer. Recon had chosen the prison as a command post. Instead, it became a rescue. That is how American tempo works. Fight, pivot, care, then do it again by the clock. Hardee moved through a city on fire. He reached the Ang Tibay shoe factory on Manila's northern edge, where newly liberated men tasted their first chocolate and joked over sauerkraut and weenies, as if those scraps were holiday meals. "I am hungry," he told Marge. General Richard J. Marshall, who handed him a carton of 10K rations that Hardy passed down a line of bony, outstretched hands. Friends arrived by jeep: Richard K. Sutherland, Charles Willoughby, Oscar Griswold, and sat on bunks with the resurrected. It looked like a reunion and felt like a revival. Then came a moment that felt like sunrise. MacArthur walked the barracks, clasped Hardy's hand, and said, "The last time I saw you, I was sending you to make infantry of the Air Corps," before adding that letters from Mrs. Hardy had arrived and that all were well. Hours later, a Red Cross worker brought stationery, pencils, and mail. Hardy received 2 letters from his wife and daughters and 1 from his mother, and he was allowed a 25-word radio message home. Back in the United States, a phone rang before church. "Turn on our radio, your husband is in Manila," and a family wept at a living room altar of good news. The enemy had expected to torch records and evacuate prisoners inland. The American advance outran their retreat. The prisoners' bodies became evidence. The rosters and diaries became testimony. From Bilibid forward, the center of gravity was simple: get there first, and bring them out alive. That day in Manila proved what American power was for turning fire into food, fear into letters home, and prisoners into people again. Did you know one American factory rolled a 4-engine bomber off the line every 63 minutes? At Willow Run in Michigan, Ford adapted car assembly to B-24 Liberators and kept the lines moving around the clock. At peak, crews averaged 1 bomber an hour. In April 1944, the plant produced 428 B-24 seconds in a single month, and over 3 days late that month a full 100 bombers flew away. Numbers like that are not trivia. They are a rescue plan written in aluminum and rivets. Every bomber, every transport, every patrol plane shortened the distance between a starving prisoner and a doctor with a clipboard and plasma. Carrier decks and submarines cut Japan's shipping lanes, while the arsenal built the air bridges and convoys that made liberation possible. Ask the hard question: why could no one else do this? Because a free people trusted each other to work to a schedule and to a purpose. Because a Detroit machinist tightening a bolt on a wing rib knew that the airplane overhead might shield a convoy or drop supplies to a trapped garrison. Because numbers, when rooted in values, change battlefields. The Japanese army had momentum in 1942, but it did not have a nation that could turn auto plants into bomber plants or train 1 million mechanics into logisticians. The enemy felt that shift like a tide. Convoys that once slid through night seas began to vanish. Unmarked hellships hid among those convoys and died with them because the Empire chose secrecy over the laws of war. The same arithmetic that built B-24 seconds built hospital wards and transport manifests. By early 1945, American divisions could assault a city block at dawn and feed 1,000 freed men by dusk, because ships, planes, radios, and trucks converged like clockwork. The pride is not just that we could do it, it is that we chose to aim that power at bringing people home. A bomber an hour sounds like legend, but it was a day shift and a night shift and a foreman's whistle. It was Rosie's rivet gun and a quartermaster's pencil. It was the arsenal of democracy rolling toward a prison gate and refusing to stop until the lock broke. Did you know the first taste many freed prisoners wanted was a square of chocolate? Hardy remembered that after liberation, he feared he would starve before the next meal because his body had forgotten normal food. He and other newly freed men were staged at the Ang Tibay shoe factory while fires still glowed over the city. "Here we tasted our first chocolate," he wrote, and "a taste of sauerkraut and weenies was better then than delicacies are now." Then came a jeep and a box of salvation. "I am hungry," he told Maj. General Richard J. Marshall, who handed him a carton of 10K rations, which Hardy carried back inside and passed out to bony, outstretched hands. In that exchange, hunger answered by logistics, you can hear a nation speaking. The next moments cut deeper. Hardy was sent back into his old ward at Bilibid, while gunfire popped across the river. MacArthur walked the barracks and clasped his hand. "The last time I saw you, I was sending you to make infantry of the Air Corps," the general said, and told him he had letters from Mrs. Hardy. Hardy cried. Hours later, a Red Cross worker brought stationery, pencils, and mail, 2 letters from his wife and daughters, 1 from his mother, and the chance to send a 25-word radio message home completed the rescue in his heart. "Turn on our radio. Your husband is in Manila," a friend told his family back home. The enemy had misread America. They believed capture erased honor and that a prisoner could be starved into silence. They did not expect an army to pivot from assault to triage in the same afternoon, nor did they expect records and rosters to turn into court exhibits. The bodies American medics examined became evidence. The letters and diaries became testimony. The names on those K-rations became a promise kept. Hardy learned that relatives at Santo Tomas had survived a night of shelling. He felt the pull of home as strongly as the grip of a rifle stock. The war was still burning, but something larger had already happened. A free country had proved what it valued most, its people, and it had done so with speed, skill, and kindness. When old friends from headquarters visited their ranks, now stars and eagles, they sat on bunks and offered anything they had. To them, Hardy and the others looked like voices from a tomb, men resurrected from the dead. From factory to convoy to foxhole to hospital ward, the system had worked like a single machine with a human heart. The chapter closes with a simple image. A 25-word message crossing the Pacific, faster than fear. Did you know 121 U.S. Army Rangers crawled across open fields to snatch 513 prisoners from behind enemy lines and got them all out alive? On the 30th of January 1945, the 6th Ranger Battalion under Lieutenant Cole, Henry Mucci, guided by Filipino guerrillas led by Captains Juan Pajota and Eduardo Joson, skulked to the wire at Cabanatuan while Japan still held the region. Captain Robert Prince's assault team cut the fence and flooded through the barracks with M1 Garands and Thompson guns, while guerrillas sealed the roads with ambushes. A few minutes later, the once hopeless survivors of Bataan were moving again. Some carried on litters, others pushed onto carabao carts, all heading for friendly lines under a black sky. One ranger whispered to a stunned prisoner, "You're going home," and the man sobbed because he had stopped believing such words existed. The revelation hit like a flare. America could move with silent patience and then explode with speed. Rangers and Alamo scouts killed the guards, burned records, and rolled out before the garrison knew what had happened. "Keep moving," a sergeant said. "Don't look back. That short command tells you everything about American tempo." The human element was everywhere. A gaunt lieutenant who had hidden his dog tags for years now gripped them like a lifeline. A medic who had learned to make saline from scrap bottles now handed out real plasma. An enlisted man with a voice like gravel said, "I thought I'd die in there." The ranger replied, "Not on my watch." The enemy's shock came with the dawn. Roadblocks they never saw had already vanished. Their patrols reached empty cages and burning paperwork. They had believed distance and darkness would hide their cruelty. Instead, the Americans erased distance with planning and erased darkness with allies who knew every path. The rescue at Cabanatuan proved a principle that would scale. America could fuse radios, rifles, parachutes, trucks, rivercraft, and a nation's will into one moving hand and open any gate it chose. The next operation would raise the stakes even higher and pull thousands out of a killing ground in broad daylight. Did you know an American airborne division dropped from the morning sky and freed more than 2,000 civilians in a single hour? On the 23rd of February 1945, the 11th Airborne Division leaped from C-47 transports onto Los Baños internment camp as amphibious tractors roared in from Laguna de Bay and Filipino guerrillas cut the road net. Parachutes popped like white flowers above the wire while scouts inside signaled the exact time to strike. Guards ran toward the noise at the gate and found a wall of American fire and guerrilla blades waiting. By noon, Families who had tasted only watery rice for years were riding out on Amtraks, clutching children, blankets, and the first cheese they had seen since 1942. The revelation was bigger than the camp. This was choreography, air, land, and water set to the same beat. It looked impossible because the clock ran so tight. Jump at dawn, breach instantly. Evacuate before enemy columns could react. Don't stop, load and go, a lieutenant shouted as he heaved a suitcase to a crying mother. The plan trusted every piece to work, just like a factory line turned into a battle drill. The human element cut through the smoke. A nurse who had stolen sips of milk for starving toddlers now stood on an Amtrak, hair whipping in the wind, and said, "I can breathe." A teenage boy who had scraped mold off bread grinned at a GI's joke and tucked a chocolate bar into his shirt like it was gold. A paratrooper with a busted boot laced it with phone wire and kept lifting people aboard. Enemy shock arrived too late. Japanese troops who raced toward the gunfire met ambushes and blown bridges. The camp, their bargaining chip, was gone. The idea that terror could hold civilians in place died on that beach. Cabanatuan and Los Baños weren't miracles. They were proof that America could turn industrial rhythm into liberation. Now, pull back the camera and see the machine that made those hours possible, the vast, humming arsenal that fed every raid, every rescue, every day. Did you know American shipyards built 2,710 Liberty ships and thousands of LSTs so fast that new harbors seemed to appear overnight? Cargo moved in rivers of steel, C-47 transports droned from island to island, and B-29 superfortresses, pressurized and brutal in range, mapped skies the enemy could no longer control. U.S. submarines. Just a sliver of the fleet sank the majority of Japan's merchant tonnage, starving factories, garrisons, and prison camps of food and fuel. Each number was a lifeline. Each crate, can, and case made a prisoner more likely to live long enough to be found. The revelation was simple and stunning. America didn't just outbuild the enemy, it turned production into precision. Willow Run's bomber an hour was not an isolated wonder. It was the example of how an entire country ran to time. Locomotives, loading cranes, convoy codes, field kitchens, and plasma banks all hitting their marks. On maps, that looks like arrows. On the ground, it looks like warm soup at dusk, and a doctor who says, "You're safe." The human element stands tall at a dock at Leyte. A stevedore from New Orleans checks a manifest with a pencil and taps a crate. Medical? Front first. A corporal slings a radio, flips the switch, and hears a voice from a destroyer 4 miles out say, "Beach secure." A nurse lays a hand on a fevered forehead and whispers, "We've got you." The enemy's shock spread by rumor. Where trucks once coughed and died, Americans ran convoys that did not stop. Where planes once came alone, American formations darkened the sky. Where hunger ruled, American rations arrived stacked to the rafters. An officer who thought he could bleed a perimeter into safety learned that numbers with purpose become a storm. The arsenal set the table. Now see the receipts, the statistics and outcomes that sound like tall tales until you read them twice. The payoff begins with the fastest mass demobilization and the biggest homecoming the world had ever seen, all while war criminals faced the ledger they wrote in other people's blood. Did you know the United States brought millions home across 2 oceans in months? A sea lift so vast it felt like continents moving. The operation had a simple nickname, Magic Carpet, and a clear promise. You fought, so we'll carry you home. Troop ships once packed for invasion now ran stacked bunks and chow lines. Navy crews hauled families from liberated camps to staging hospitals, then to transports, then to ports where bands played and trains waited. The same system that hurled divisions forward turned around on a dime to bring sons and fathers back. The revelation keeps growing. The nation that built 297,000 aircraft and thousands of cargo ships also built schedules with the same ferocity. A corporal's duffel bag and a captain's orders landed on the same pier within hours. That precision is not poetry. It's the American habit of writing down a time and making it real. The human element is a thin man in a wool coat stepping onto a gangway at San Francisco. He smells coffee, grease, and salt. A Red Cross volunteer says, "Welcome home," and pins a card to his lapel. In a radio studio across the city, a switch flips, and a family hears, "I am safe." He never thought he would hear his own name again. Now it echoes in a station full of cheering strangers. The enemy felt the verdict in courtrooms as well as ports. Records from camps and marches became exhibits. Officers who once mocked the Geneva rules stood to be measured by them. The lesson was blunt. The same America that builds ships builds laws, and both travel far. Homecoming proves what production was for. The next surprise shows how deep that power ran into bandages, blood banks, rations, and radios, tiny things that stacked into a mountain and made the difference between life and death in the hour after the gates swung open. Did you know a pint of plasma can move a man from death to life faster than a rifle can change a battle? On rescue days, medics lugged plasma cans like treasure and lined up litters beneath palm trees, while cooks fired up field stoves for broth that wouldn't shock starved stomachs. Quartermasters counted K-rations by name and cereal, making sure each freed man had salt, sugar, and vitamins in the right order. Signalmen carried radios on their backs and bent over handsets to call in Amtraks, trucks, or a flight of C-47 seconds. The choreography looked small from the sky. Up close, each act glowed. The revelation is a quiet one. Dominance isn't always loud. Sometimes it is a checklist, read in the rain and followed to the letter. A nation that can land a division can also calibrate spoons and syringes. That is how you end a famine gently and turn trauma into sleep. The human element sits at a folding table. A nurse stirs cocoa and says, "Sip." A doctor notes a temperature and murmurs, "Holding." An infantryman hands over his last chocolate square. "For later," he says. But the freed man eats it now, eyes closed, smiling like a child. Enemy shock flickered and died. Guards who once swaggered now hid from their own civilians as witnesses lined up behind clipboards. The idea that cruelty could rule by fear collapsed when ordinary Americans arrived with blankets, clean water, and forms that spelled every name right. The fear retreated because order took its place. We have seen rescues from the wire, from the sky, and from the sea. We have watched factories keep time with parachutes and radios. Now, we close with the clearest answer to the hardest question. Why, America? And why no one else could have done it like this? Did you know the same country that moved an entire headquarters under fire on Christmas Eve also moved an entire people across an ocean and back again? That through 73 days on Bataan, men kept their standard when food and bullets were gone? That when law failed them, they kept a ledger anyway, names, dates, causes, so justice would someday find its way? Those facts stand next to the numbers. Bombers by the hour, submarines that choked an empire, liberty ships so numerous a dockman could forget which river he was on. The story is simple. Freedom scales. The revelation ties every chapter into one rope. America did not just overpower, it over-organized. It turned values into schedules, schedules into convoys, and convoys into gates opened on time. It listened to a lieutenant say, "I am hungry," and turned that sentence into a supply line that did not stop until he could write a 25-word message home. The human element belongs to the survivors. A gaunt officer gripping his dog tags, a mother on an Amtrak clutching bread and a child, a ranger with mud on his face saying, "Don't look back." A general who had once sent airmen to dig in like infantry taking a freed man's hand and saying, "Your family is safe." The enemy's final shock was not a bombardment, it was the sight of Americans counting every life like it mattered and building a machine that served that belief. You can measure power in tonnage and sorties, or you can measure it in letters delivered, records kept, and gates opened on time. We chose both. Closing punch. We didn't just win. We came back for our own. Factories, ships, radios, parachutes, pencils, every piece did its job. That is why this story still feels impossible. That is why the numbers still make your heart race. And that is why, when someone asks what American power is for, the answer is still the same. To find our people, wherever they are, and bring them home.